Well, thank you, Luc, for taking time out to do this, because Corey and I are very excited about the book and appreciative of your time, both in writing the chapter, but also in agreeing to do an interview with us to help promote it. And we wanted to start by asking, why did you agree to write this chapter?
Oh, well, I agreed to write this chapter because as I was working through my dissertation research, which is where these ideas come from, I started to notice that the material I was reading, the methodological material that I was reading, felt like it was missing two things for me. And I did a lot of reading to get ready, because doing the kind of digital ethnographic methods that I used in my dissertation, there just is not a lot of research in the leisure space that sort of mapped to that for me. So I was reaching out into different places, and I wasn't getting a lot of connection back to sort of what's happening in the digital sphere that makes it different for qualitative research. And I wasn't getting a lot there. I mean, there's a lot of research out there in the digital space that talks about social justice issues, but there's not a lot out there that was really talking about sort of how to do this research in the kind of social justice context that this book talks about. So how to sort of move that research and focus it in a social justice kind of orientation. And so for me, when you asked if I was interested, I was, because what I wanted was to be able to provide for others some of that labor that I had to do to sort of round out this research approach that I was doing. And this seemed like a great opportunity to do that. So, I mean, I was happy to take on that challenge to try and write that out in a way that made sense.
Thank you. You mentioned in your answer social justice. Can you explain what you mean by that and how you employ it within your chapter for the book?
So, for me, social justice is about working and moving in directions of equity. And so as a researcher, when I think about social justice, I think about, well, how does my research serve to benefit ideas of moving towards equity in society? As a person who presents the way that I present, as like a cishet white dude, there are lots of times where it's easy for me to see myself in those who receive the sort of rightfully most critique for anti-equity and anti-justice views. So like racism and sexism and those kinds of things, right? Like it's pretty easy sometimes for me to see versions of myself on the other side of that. And so for me as a researcher, when I think about social justice, it's about, okay, so how can I, who often, both physically especially, could be representative of sort of like the man, right? Or of the of spaces of control, how can I do work to sort of dismantle that control, or at least highlight these facets of control in the spirit of equity, right? So when I'm thinking about social justice, those are the things that I'm thinking about. How can I contribute to those larger social processes of equity and sort of reduction of control and reduction of oppression in different ways?
Interesting. And what sort of theoretical frameworks do you use or employ within the book to do that work?
So the chapter in the book is a bit more, I think, procedural, I think is the way that I would describe it, in that I'm sort of asking people to confront the ways that they think about research in the digital, to help them understand that the social justice context of doing research in the digital goes beyond how we might think about representation in our research participants, or sort of who we're asking questions to, right? There are all of these other infrastructural things in the digital that are important to that. And so for me, from a theoretical context, I mean, I come into this research specifically from a masculinities theory space, right? I'm interested in gender and power and masculinities. And then that is extended into the digital in a lot of really important ways. So like the way that we think about who can exist in the digital is tied up in masculinity, but it's also tied up in socioeconomic status, and it's tied up in race, and it's tied up into all of these elements that we have to consider in social justice. So the question of like what theoretical perspectives do I sort of bring in to use in the chapter? I mean, all of these things have to be part of it, because you need to be able to understand how those systems affect people and those systems affect systems in order to understand how then the digital affects your research and your research space. And so, I mean, at the risk of sounding like I'm sort of picking and choosing off the apple tree, I mean, all of those bits become really important in order to understand the argument that I'm making, that you need to understand them in order to do high quality social justice digital research.
So clearly you've collected a lot of those little bits off the apple tree. Can you help the reader understand how your thinking has progressed? Where has it evolved from? Where did you start along this line of thinking?
Oh, that's a great question, because I think when I started this, so my research is on Reddit, which is a website that I had a history with before I started this research. And so when I started, I was just like, oh, I'm interested in masculinities and how it's manifesting on Reddit in these particular communities. That came, a little bit later. And then as I started really looking at it, really digging into it, sort of spending a lot of time in the space, I started to really understand that there was just so much more happening there than being able to sort of parachute in these communities and taking down what they said and being like, see, these people are saying these things. And so at first it was just this feeling of like, okay, what am I missing? There's more happening here than I thought. And I mean, this is going to be a similar story, I think, to other folks as they engage with qualitative inquiry in sort of deep and rich kind of ways. And I started to go, okay, so what is it that's different? What is it that I need to know more about in order to understand what's going on here? And some of that came from mentors that I had that said, okay, well, what about this? Why aren't you talking about this? What about these larger issues? Some of it was from coursework, right? I took a class that really sort of introduced me to the infrastructures that run the internet, for example, that I sort of knew about, as a technology-oriented person, but I didn't really know the deep kinds of influence that they can have over, say, access, right? And so infrastructure becomes so important with access to the internet, because there's quite a large percentage of Canadians that don't have reliable broadband internet. And if you don't have reliable broadband internet, can you access a website like Reddit reliably? No. And so then those people are not necessarily represented in this space, right? So it became this layer cake of, oh, what about this? What about this? What about this? When I started with just like, oh, I'm gonna go and learn about these discourses of masculinity in this space. This will be great, and it'll be so interesting. And then that became just the base layer in this really sort of complicated research project, what turned out to be a really much more complex research project. And I'm not quite sure if I got to where you were asking me to get to there, but
I think you did. And it just made me think, maybe you could explain it in a little bit more depth. I think you touch on it there about why masculinity and social justice and digitality, how these all come together and how they work well for the type of research you want to do.
Oh, yeah, I mean, thinking about masculinity and as an extension of thoughts about gender and power relationships, sort of is my entree into thinking about social justice sort of in the larger context, right? That is what started to interest me about any sort of equity issues. I sort of looked around me, looked at my own like my own parents, and went like, well, this is not the messaging that I've gotten from the outside world. What happens at my house is not the same as like what's supposed to happen, but it seems to work really well. Why is there this other thing? Like, I don't get it. And so when I started to do research at the university level and then in graduate school, I was thinking like, I don't get it. This isn't how I grew up, and then I was introduced through a variety of means and great thinkers in women's studies and in rec and leisure as well, around like, oh, well, these issues are, you're thinking about gender and that's really important, and maybe you're thinking about men and masculinity and that's really important, but there's also this and there's also this and there's also this. And so then in my sort of larger thinking about social justice now, okay, I'm sort of getting this broader context. I learn about intersectionality and I go, okay, all right, here we go. Now, I'm sort of I'm getting into the flow a little bit here. I'm starting to understand that all of these things coming together and interacting with one another have these particular outcomes. So as I enter into this digital research space, specifically focused on masculinity, right? Like that was why I wanted to do it, right? I research men's rights communities. Like I was like, okay, there's some weird masculinity stuff going on here. Let's get into it. I really quickly, I think, was like, oh well, there's more, right? And so for me, this through line, you asked about sort of masculinity and social justice and digitality and how it becomes this through line where I start at this end on digitality and masculinity, and I'm like, well, okay, well, but what masculinity is happening here? Well, it's hetero and it's white mostly, and it does these things. And then that sort of allowed me, I'm going to say work backwards, but that's only in context of sort of visualizing it, right? Working backwards into the broader context. As I did the research, I went forward into this broader context, but that's it's a harder metaphor to get your head around, I think. But into sort of, okay, well, why is it like that? And then those become social justice issues. So while I'm interested in sort of the masculinity and the oppressive frameworks that are happening in that space, right, where there's a lot of male supremacism in men's rights spaces, there's a lot of, it is a heteronormative space, period. There is barely any, if any, discussion about like gay relationships. They just don't talk about it, right? But my understandings about social justice then sort of force me to go, okay, well, why is it like that? And that has links back to the technology. So then it becomes this cycle of like, the masculinities make me think about this thing, which makes me come back to the sort of larger intersectional context of social justice, which makes me think about this other thing that connects to the masculinities, and just sort of went around and around and around until I had to just go like, okay, I had to write about something. Let's write about these things. And then like, why did that feel so complicated? Why did I have to do so much work? That, eventually leads us here to this conversation, right? So, very long answer to your question, but I think it's just a really complicated question, right? How are you teasing, how are you connecting these dots? Well, I drew the line, but then I drew it a bunch more times after that.
Got it. What type of data do you typically collect?
So largely my data is a kind of manual scraping. So that's not a complicated term. Internet data is collected in a few different ways, right? One of the ways, the sort of big data ways, are to use entrees into software platforms, right? Internet platforms like Reddit or Twitter or Facebook or whatever. They all have this sort of back end that you can go in and you can collect mass amounts of data based on certain search parameters or time frames or whatever, and you can get, like millions, billions of tweets, and then you can put those into analysis software and you can do that sort of thing. And I thought about doing that, but that wasn't the kind of immersive experience that I was interested in. Right? You can definitely get lost in that data because there's a ton of it, but like it just didn't sit quite right for me. I needed to, and I mean, this goes back to sort of my talk what I was saying before about sort of being who I am. I mean, somebody told me once that I would fit right in if I went to a men's rights gathering in person, right? Like I have the right, and I'm taking that a little bit out of context, but I was interested in an experience even more than I was interested in what are the sort of straight discourses that are happening in these spaces. And so the kind of data that I collect is I go, say, to Reddit, and then I take snapshots, essentially full thread pictures of these threads. And then I do that so that they can exist for me in perpetuity, right? Like, well, you know, as long as digital stuff can exist, but so that I can have that snapshot and I can go to it and I can read it as it was at that time, because the internet, you know, all social media style platforms are sort of always changing, right? They're sort of always, you know, if you go to a Facebook thread now and an hour from now, it's going to look different. Well, the same with Reddit. And so I took these snapshots to say, in this place at this time, these things were going on. I took hundreds of those over the course of 3 months. And then I read them all. I mean, it wound up is like 26,000 individual comments. And this is on top of sort of being in this space every day. As an observer, reading content titles, clicking on things, you know, following links, that sort of stuff. So it's this combination of ethnographic data in the context of sort of long-term exposure and data collection and note-taking and then this very systematic sort of snapshot data collection, and then reviewing all of that manually. So, you know, I use some software to help me I have for my dissertation, I had an Excel where I went old school, I had an Excel workbook, but I also had a OneNote, a OneNote notebook that had a lot of notes in it, right? So, but I didn't use, say, like NVivo or a qualitative analysis software, because for me, it was really important to be doing that labor and sort of living through that labor and not using a program to be like, well, how many times did this come up and what are the patterns in this data? I think that kind of data collection is really important and can be really fruitful. It just wasn't the approach that I wanted to take. I wanted a much more sort of analog experience of the digital, and that some people will be like, that doesn't make sense. But for me, it was, I want to say tactile, right? It's just a different kind of exposure that I think is really important when we are talking about discourses and rhetoric and ideology. I think it's really easy to take textual data and then make inferences about the discourse and the ideology that's happening in that textual data, but context is very important, right? And so things that are said on Reddit, just like things that are said, idioms, that sort of stuff that's said on Facebook or TikTok or, you know, insert social media here, 4chan, if you really want to go in extreme spaces, things said there, if you don't understand the context of not just the subcommunity you're in, but the larger space, say, of Reddit, right? There are turns of phrase and memes and idioms on Reddit that don't really exist in the same way elsewhere. And if you don't understand that stuff, then the analysis that you do always will miss something, right? And things that people say in a men's rights community on Reddit in context are sometimes different than if you just take the disconnected text and analyze it. Sometimes it's spot on, that's exactly what they meant, but sometimes it's not, right? There's these contextual differences, and I think that is largely lost if you don't have this kind of exposure and at least familiarity with the spaces that you're researching. So I think, I mean, you asked me about what kind of data that I collect. but this all sort of cycles back into the why of the chapter, is that sort of context, right? That idea, that familiarity, that exposure becomes essential to being able to talk about the space. And perhaps if you are, researching something really innocuous, like the Everybody Loves Badminton Club on Facebook, you can sort of take that text data and at the, produce a paper that says, see, everybody loves badminton. And that's fine. But on Reddit, I mean, there's just so much more nuance happening, even in communities that are ostensibly dedicated to single goals, right? Men's rights, whatever, That, I mean, that's a very complicated example, but like the Everybody Loves Badminton Club on Reddit, I would bet actually probably isn't about badminton at all, first of all, right? Like it's that sort of important nuance that's happening in the space. And so that contributes to why I collected the kind of data that I collected. And then subsequently a big part of this chapter, which is like, you got to know where you're at if you're researching on the internet, because if you don't know, if you're like, I'm going to go and research this contentious community on Reddit, and you don't understand the community, you can get yourself in deep trouble.
So that's a nice segue into my next question, which is around the ethical issues that emerge from this type of research, because clearly there's a lot going on there ethically.
There's a lot. I think there's two. We could talk for a very long time about it. But I'm going to say two things I think are really important about the ethical considerations. The first one is, you need to, as a researcher engaging in digital research, you need to have a really good understanding both of your own sort of personal concept of public and private data, and then combining that with whatever institutional concepts of public and private digital data, what that means at your institution. And they may not have a great, as nuanced an understanding of that as you, if you're even thinking about this. I mean, you have a more nuanced understanding of it than most people. But like, data in online communities comes in a lot of different ways. And so you could have strictly public data. And a great example of that is most of Twitter. Not all of Twitter, but most of Twitter exists in this sort of, and I mean, Elon Musk is in the news right now because he says he wants to buy Twitter and turn it back, rescue it or whatever garbage he has to say about that. But this sort of public square idea of just sort of like, this is the public space and you just say whatever you want. And people just know that this is public, right? And so largely it is easy and understandable to go and sort of collect whatever Twitter data you want and then use that because it exists in the public. What becomes challenging about this concept of public and private is, do you need a login to get into the space? On top of that, do you need an invite to get a login to get into the space? So something like Reddit, all you need is an email address, right? You can go and a username, and you can go and get on Reddit. You can get into most spaces on Reddit that way. But like something like Gab or some alt text stuff, you need an invitation in order to get a login, right? So now if you're collecting data from there, those people do have a presumption of privacy. Yeah. And there are private Reddit communities. So it's not only do I need a login, but then also do I need some sort of invitation or gatekeeper access to get into these spaces. So when I was doing my research on the two communities that I did for my dissertation, I didn't need that. I had a login just so that I could keep things organized better, but I did not need a login to access any of the content. That has since changed. One of the communities now, you do need a login and a verified email address just to look at it. And that has to do with Reddit politics, right? But if I were to start my dissertation research now, the parameters around is this public or private data have changed.
Interesting.
And so understanding how you understand public and private data and being able to articulate that, especially vis-a-vis your ethics review, is really important. And the researchers that do this kind of work won't necessarily agree with you, right? Like I have colleagues that also do similar work to me, and we don't necessarily agree on what's public and what's private and how you should access it and all of those things. So that's a really important ethical consideration because, I mean, some IRBs will say, well, this is public, you don't even need an IRB review. And others will say, well, this is private data, you need a full human subjects review. And some will say, you don't really need this, but we're happy to review it. That's what I did. I submitted anyway, because I wanted to sort of feel free and clear there. So that's the first, I think, really, really, really important consideration. The second one, which is something I'm thinking a lot about these days, is depending on the community that you're researching, or maybe not depending on the community, but how do you choose to attribute your data? So are you using verbatim quotes? If you're using verbatim quotes, are you using verbatim usernames? Because the issue that is different in the digital context of this consideration, that's very different from the sort of analog, fleshy context of regular qualitative research, is that in regular interviews, I let people choose their pseudonym and off we go, right? It doesn't matter if I quote them because nobody is going to listen to their interview or look at my transcripts that has the whatever, right? Like, that's how we obfuscate people, and it works really, really well. Online, if I just obfuscate your username and I'm using public data, if I just drop that quote into a search engine, wham, I can get that stuff pretty quick. And so you need to think really hard in the ethical context of, am I going to use verbatim quotes? Then if I'm using verbatim quotes, am I using verbatim usernames? And do I consider this published material? Am I quoting this material, or am I using it as research data, right? Because those two things are not necessarily the same either. So am I giving author attribution, et cetera, et cetera? Then if I'm choosing to obfuscate usernames, do I also need to obfuscate content? Do I need to engage with Markham's sort of rewriting of things in order to get my message across, but not sort of leave this user who has provided this data sort of out to dry? And lots of researchers that do research on digital communities, that vulnerable digital communities, I mean, a lot of this is social justice oriented research, will say, absolutely, you need to obfuscate usernames, you need to obfuscate quotes, and you need to do that labor in order to protect these folks. And those are really great and important arguments. On the flip side of that, if you research contentious communities like me, I have chosen to quote verbatim and provide usernames verbatim. Because for me, that's an expository exercise, right? It's an exercise of a kind of academic activism that says, hey, this is a male supremacist space, or this is a white supremacist space. And what these people are saying, even though it's sort of cloistered in here, we need to know about it. And I mean, then there are all kinds of other considerations. I'm going to wrap this up because, again, I said, we could talk for hours about this specific question, but then do you run into issues of amplification? Mm-hmm. Are you exposing these ideas to people that they would never have been exposed to? Yes, sometimes. And perhaps if I were publishing in a different context, a much wider reach context, that my research data anyway, maybe I would make a different decision about that. But the reach of my feminist and social justice scholarship is almost exclusively read by other feminist and social justice scholars. And so I'm not particularly concerned about radicalizing feminist and social justice scholars to the men's rights movement, right? I'm not worried about pivoting those people into men's rights activists. Mm-hmm. And so that's the decision that I've made. That might not be the decision that everybody else made. It's not the decision that everybody researching the kind of communities that I do has made either. But those two things, I think, are the two most important ethical considerations, along with all of the other ethical considerations that you have as a qualitative researcher, right? Like, this is a really sort of deep and important set of things to think about.
And you talk about some of the larger issues in your chapter as well. That was very interesting. In your previous answer, you noted the sheer amount of data that you collect. With that in mind, how do you typically analyze your data?
It takes a very long time. It takes a very long time. Somebody very wise who may or may not be an editor of this book, when I was sort of commenting about how big the data space was, said to me, yeah, you get a data mountain. That's the nature of this kind of research, and you have to work your way through it. And so, I mean, my analysis for my dissertation really involves sort of like a systematic reading of all of those things. Sort of read and note and read and note and read and note, which is where the Excel table and the OneNote notebook, all of those things became really, are essential to. I mean, I guess you could do that all manually, but it seemed as though doing a digital project, I should probably use digital tools. And so, I mean, if you are doing the kind of analysis that I'm doing, it winds up looking quite a lot like other kinds of qualitative analysis, right? Where you are sort of reading what are the equivalent of transcripts and reading the equivalent of your research, or reading your research notes, and then creating secondary notes, helping to categorize things. One of the great things about doing this all digitally is that you can back search things. So as I'm going through and I have this epiphany, I can go back and I can search the 10,000 comments I've previously read to see, was this happening there and I missed it, right? You can do those sorts of things. So for me, just the same way that I chose to do the research that I did, the way that I analyzed that data looks a lot like sort of analog qualitative research analysis. I talk about scraping and computer assisted analysis in the chapter, and that's a really valuable thing, right? Because not everybody is a doc student with the time to manually read, code, analyze, and reanalyze 26,000 internet comments, right? Like, we maybe don't have that time. And so those tools can really help us if we have a good foundation. And that's what I talk about in the chapter around that, because that's not the approach that I took. But I'm saying, like, these tools can be really, really, really useful if we attend to these really important background items that have to do with, our own positionality and our understanding of the research space and the technologies involved there.
Interesting. Mm-hmm. With that in mind, how would you say that the crisis of representation and or legitimation play out in your research, either in the collection, analysis, or the representation of your data?
For me, that's a hard question. And part of it is because the personas that we are sort of taking in as research subjects or research participants or interlocutors, however you want to contextualize how your data is coming from, folks, are these avatar representations, right? So as we're thinking about these things that really challenge us as qualitative researchers, we are making them even more complicated by not being able to sort of see those people as I see you. And so when I think about representation and legitimation, one of the things that I'm thinking about is how does the complexity of not really knowing who's on the other end play into that. And that seems a bit, I think, like a tangential way to get to my answer. But when I think about then representing the data and how do I know that my analysis is legitimate, that becomes a thing that if I'm not at least thinking it through and probably talking about it as part of my analysis, then it shows that I'm not doing the kind of sort of deep consideration that I need to do in order to be able to say, no, I actually understand a lot about this, and I'm not just sort of scraping data and regurgitating that data and saying, see, look, I did a thing, right? And for me, that's one of the core pieces of that representational and legitimation process that needs to happen, is that I have to be able to work with all of those pieces. And I know, like, and this is perhaps not as direct as I wanted to be, but that maybe belies how complicated it is for me in my head about how do I get to a point where I can say, like, where I can present data or I can present my research and not have to then immediately encounter all of these questions of, like, how do you know it's legitimate, and how, you know, I have to understand the back end of all of that. And so I think probably I should stop there, because otherwise I'm going to go down another, like, weird tangent and it's not going to make any sense. But yeah, did I even get to what you asked me there?
Thank you. Do you find that writing around these types of topics differs for you than other types of academic topics that you've explored?
Yeah, it does. I think I'm really, really lucky because I had mentors, and you know, was an RA on projects, especially as I did my dissertation, that called me to sort of do a lot of theory-based thinking and writing. And so for me, it prepped me a little bit to be able to sort of get lost in the weeds, which I clearly am sometimes, given the length of some of my answers to your questions. But, you know, it sort of prepped me to do that sort of thinking. It's really different than, okay, we did these interviews and we have this data, now let's write a paper about this data and what it means in the context of the space that these people exist in, right? So those two things for me they exist differently. I don't think that one is necessarily more difficult than the other, but it's absolutely a different way of approaching the thinking and writing. I don't know if I answered your question at all.
Yeah, I think you did. There. So that's a really interesting answer. With that in mind, what is the one thing you would like other students or scholars to know about doing digitally mediated research?
Same, but different. Okay. So digitally mediated research is, I mean, it's the same as qualitative digitally mediated research is the same as doing any other qualitative research, right? You have the same ethical implications, you have the same issues to contend with around representation and who you talk to and the questions you ask and all of those things. So it's the same, but it's different because there's this additional layer. So unless you run into in a social justice and representation and intersectional context, you have all of those same issues online as you do offline, but there's this layer between you and your participants in the digital that you must absolutely contend with in order to be able to say things that have real meaning and real power, I think. Because if you're going to go into a community on Telegram and talk about what's happening in this community on Telegram, which is a social media platform, but that is mostly populated by folks on the right, on the far right, and you don't have a good understanding of Telegram and the technological things that allow Telegram to exist and flourish and continue to function, then you can't. There will be a disconnect between what you observe and how you are able to talk about that academically. So when I say same but different, I mean, you have all of the regular issues that you have to contend with in any other kind of qualitative research, but then there are additional things that you must absolutely consider, or you're gonna wind up in a spicy situation, perhaps.
So clearly it's an area, a methodological area that is still evolving and relatively new. Looking forward, what would you say are what's one thing that would be critical to the future to this methodology?
I think we're going to see a big shift over the next 5 or 10 years in how we're talking about this for a couple of reasons. One, we just have a lot of younger people who are much more digital native coming into academia through their PhD and that sort of thing, that just have a different life experience around these spaces, and that's really important. And then I think that our understanding, because we're really only 40 years into networked communication available to people, and really only maybe 25 years into sort of good penetration of the internet in people's homes. That's not very long.
No.
And so we, in the next, it won't take very long for a lot of change to happen, I think. And so I'm excited to see how this evolves and how it evolves relative to other kinds of research, and how we understand those things, both as separate but also as similar and the same.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So as it evolves, what is one piece of advice you'd give to researchers taking up this methodology?
Doing research on the internet isn't as quick and dirty as you think it is, or at least it shouldn't be. There's a lot happening there, and I think there's a lot you need to know in order to do it well. And so, it's possible to do like quick and dirty internet research, but know that that's what you're doing. Acknowledge that that's what you're doing, because that's pretty important.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Luc, for your time today. This has been a great interview. You've taught me a lot, and thank you again for your chapter. It's made a major and significant contribution to our book.
Thanks, my pleasure. Thanks for letting me just yammer on about your questions. I know it was great.